Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week, on our Against the Odds poll, we had a bunch of Hour of Devastation options, and we have that again this week. So if you want to vote for the poll, follow the link in the description to the article on the site. We got another All Against Odds poll, so check that out. But in the end of our last poll, it was Desert Tribal coming out on top. So this week, we're heading to Hour of Devastation Standard to see if we can win with land synergies. We're built around deserts, we got tons of cool desert tricks, and seeing if deserts actually have the power to compete in the standard format. So let's talk a bit about Desert Tribal. First off, we have to look at our non-desert cards to really understand what this deck is trying to do. So the Gitrog Monster is probably the most important card in our deck. 5 mana, it's huge. A 6/6, which makes it really hard to kill. A Braid doesn't kill it, Fatal Push doesn't kill it, Grasp of Darkness doesn't kill it. A lot of removal can't kill the Gitrog Monster. And then it does a couple of things we really want. First off, it lets us sack a land, which seems like a downside, but in our deck, we actually want to be sacking lands. We have some lands that are built around going back and forth from our graveyard to the library, so that's kind of an upside a lot of times in our deck. Plus, it lets us play an extra land each turn, and then we get to draw cards whenever a land goes to our graveyard, so it works really well with deserts, which do two things primarily. I mean, there's a couple odd deserts, but the two main thing deserts do is let you sacrifice them from the battlefield, or sacrifice a desert from the battlefield to do something, which draws us a card with Gitrog Monster, or they cycle, which also draws us a card with Gitrog Monster, so we can cycle a desert for 2 mana and we draw 2 new cards, which is a great deal if we have Gitrog Monster out. The second piece of our deck is Ramunap Excavator, which lets us play lands from our graveyard. So this works super well, not only with deserts, because we cycle them, we sack them, we get them back, but with the Gitrog Monster, because we get back the lands we sack with the Gitrog Monster, and we can get back an additional land each turn, so even though we're sacking our lands, we're actually gaining mana each turn. We're still getting an extra land on the battlefield, thanks to our ability to just keep getting back the lands from the graveyard, and getting back an extra one, so we completely get rid of the downside of sacking lands with the Gitrog Monster, and we're still slowly developing our mana base. The last important piece of our deck, before we start talking lands, is Hour of Promise. So Hour of Promise in our deck does a couple of different things. First off, we have a lot of 1 of, 2 of lands that do important things to our deck, but they're colorless or they're off color, and we can't really afford to play 4 of them. So Hour of Promise works like a land tutor to get specific lands that we need in certain situations. We can get graveyard hate lands, we can get creature making lands, we can get finisher lands, we can get creature lands. There's so many 1 of lands that we can find. Hour of Promise just holds that all together. Plus, it's a good way to slow down the game. It makes 2 zombies. We're almost always going to have the required number of deserts to get the zombie tokens, and then we can jump with them, help us stay alive. Our deck really wants to get to the late game. We have a amazing late game engine. The challenge is getting there, and sometimes just having a couple zombies to chump block on Long Tusk Cubs, to chump block on Ronuses and things like that are actually really important to what we're trying to do. So let's talk a bit about the lands, and kind of our finishing plan with our deserts involves Sun-Scourged Desert and Dunes of the Dead. So what we can do, if we can get Ramunap Excavator and the Gitrog Monster on the battlefield, on our upkeep, let's say we sack the Dunes of the Dead, we end up getting a 2/2 zombie, for free, pretty good deal. Then we can just immediately get back the Dunes of the Dead with Ramunap Excavator, so the next turn we can sack it again, get another zombie. We can even sack it to some of our other deserts to get the zombie right away, get it back again. Sun-Scourged Desert, on the other hand, pings our opponent for 1 when it enters the battlefield, so we can, every turn, hit for damage, hit for 2 damage by just getting it back and forth from our graveyard with Ramunap Excavator and Gitrog Monster, and ever so slowly drain our opponent out of the game. And remember, we're drawing cards as this happens with the Gitrog Monster, so the late game engine is super insane. The zombies let us chump, Sun-Scourged Desert actually kills our opponent. As far as the rest of the deck, Deathcap Cultivator, Servant of the Conduit, just to ramp into our big stuff. We got our Gitrog Monsters, we got our Hour of Promises, a lot of kind of expensive mid-rangey stuff. Our other desert payoff is Ramunap Hydra, which is a really interesting card. So our deck is almost always going to have a desert in the graveyard because we're sacking them to Gitrogs, we're cycling them, and we're always going to have one on the battlefield because like 75% of our lands are deserts. So that means Ramunap Hydra is going to be a 5/5 Vigilance Trample Reach for 4 mana, which is actually a pretty powerful threat. That is a big creature. It tramples over, so it's hard to jump. It blocks flyers like Cloudblazer, like Spell Queller. So it's a pretty reasonable payoff. I mean, the downside is it's just a creature, and it's still 4 mana, so it does die to Fatal Push, but it dodges a lot of other removals. So this is kind of just our big finisher. We slam it down, start attacking with it, and hopefully closing out the game quickly. And then Tireless Tracker and Thought-Knot Seer are other things that work well with deserts, but not directly. So Tireless Tracker takes advantage of the Ramunap Excavator loop. So we're sacking the land to Gitrog. We're getting it back with Ramunap Excavator. If we have a Tireless Tracker out, we're getting 1 or 2 clues a turn as we go through that process, which we can then sacrifice to draw more cards. So like I said, the late game is just super insane. We will outdraw any deck in the format if we get to the late game and get our stuff set up. Thought-Knot, and actually the other Eldrazi too, but Thought-Knot's the only one we have, takes advantage of the fact that a lot of deserts make colorless land, so it's kind of a free roll to play a really powerful Thought-Knot Seer. Mostly good against controlling decks. I mean, it's fine all around. Worse against aggro, because it's a bit slow against mono red or something. So we got 1 in the main deck, and then we have more in the sideboard as well for control matchups and mid-range matchups. And then we have a single Splendid Reclamation, which the idea is, let's say we sack a bunch of lands, we don't have access to a Ramunap Excavator, we can't find one, it dies or something. We can use Splendid Reclamation to just get back 2, 3, 4, 5 lands that we sack to our Gitrog Monster, which gives us a lot more fuel for our Gitrog Monster, a lot more desert sacrifices and so forth. And then for removal, Grasp of Darkness, Fatal Push, just trying to slow our opponent down in the early game. As I mentioned a couple of times, our deck loves the late game. If we can get to the late game, we do crazy things, but we gotta make it to the late game, so having early game removal helps. And then Never to Return, just a hedge against Planeswalkers, also a weird graveyard hate spell, so a fine one of. Let's talk about the rest of our deserts. So we talked about kind of our finishing deserts, the ones we're looking to sacrifice and get back. Desert of the Glorified and Desert of the Indomitable are our cycling deserts. They add the colors of mana that we want, and they work really well with Gitrog Monster and Ramunap Excavator. We can cycle them to draw 2 cards with Gitrog Monster, 1 from cycling, 1 from a land going to the graveyard. And then if we have Ramunap Excavator, we just get it back, so we can kind of cycle for free in our deck, since we can still get the land onto the battlefield. Plus, they up our desert count for Hour of Promise. They give us deserts we can sack to some of our other effects. So we have Hostile Desert, Ifnu Rivulet, and Ifnur Dreadlands, and these are other deserts that take advantage of all the lands going into our graveyard. So Hostile Desert, 1 of tutor target for our Hour of Promise. We can tutor it up since we're sacrificing lands and cycling lands. We can turn it into a 3/4 creature. Ifnu Rivulet probably looks really weird, and it is pretty weird, but it is the cheapest way for us to sacrifice our own deserts to a land. So we can tutor them out, and then we, for just 3 mana essentially, 2 and then tapping the desert itself, we're able to sacrifice any of our deserts, which gets us lands in our graveyard for our Excavator, draws us cards with our Gitrog Monster, and it can even be a finisher. In the late game, if we have a ton of lands on the battlefield, we can just activate this 2 or 3 times each turn by getting them back and forth with our Excavators and Gitrog Monsters, and mill a decent chunk of cards, like milling 8 cards per turn from our opponent's deck over the course of 4 or 5 turns is gonna close out the game without us ever attacking. Ifnur Dreadlands kind of does the same thing, a little slower since it costs so much mana, but if we get the setup going, it can kind of become a hard lock. We can sack it, kill a small creature, or make a big creature smaller, get it back with our Ramunap Excavator, sack it again, hit something else. If we got a Gitrog Monster out, we can get it back again, so we can just slowly eat away our opponent's board. It's like the slowest Plague Winds of all time, but it still has a lot of value, killing things, and it comes in untapped, which is the nice side of both of these. As far as the non-desert lands, Blooming Marsh and Aether Hub just make sure we can cast our stuff. 1 swamp, 1 forest. Only trick here is we don't have a lot of energy production. We have Aether Hub and Servant of the Conduit, But in the late game, say we run out of energy, we can sacrifice Ether Hub to our Gitrog Monster, get it back with Ramunap Excavator, which gives us another energy to make sure we can keep tapping for mana of whatever color we need. In the sideboard, Bantu's Last Reckoning, Never to Return, Fatal Push, Collective Brutality, a whole bunch of removal for creature-based matchups. If we run into aggressive decks, blue-white monument decks, mono-red aggro decks, we want to be able to bring in more early game removal to help survive to the late game. And then if we run into more controlling and mid-range decks, our plan is to bring in a bunch of discard over our Fatal Pushes and things like that. So we got Lay Bare the Heart, Transgress the Mind, and the rest of the Thought-Knot Seers. Finally, Scavenger Grounds gives us a Graveyard Hate Desert, only a one of, but we can tutor it up with our Hour of Promise. Beats on Reanimator decks, even just decks that are using their graveyard, like Blue-White Monument's a good example, with Dustodon. And then Sandworm Convergence, I really want this card to work, and someday I'm going to cast it, so I keep sticking it as a one-of in sideboard, so we'll see. Maybe we'll run into the perfect matchup where opponent's playing Flying Tribal, and Sandworm Convergence just wins us the game. And that is Desert Tribal for Standard, and that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. So, is this deck going to work? And I think we have some sweet things going for it. I have a couple of concerns. Our mana base is going to be a bit clunky. One of the problems with deserts is we don't have dual land deserts. So to be Desert Tribal, we need lots of deserts, and that means playing a really clunky mana base. Not many duals, and a lot of lands that come into play tap. So I think our scary matchups are against aggro, where there's a reasonable chance we get run over. So we'll see what happens, see what the matchups look like. I think it's going to be fun either way. It gets to play a lot of cards I really like and get to try out a lot of the new cards from Hour of Devastation. So let's see how it goes. Anyway, that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. Desert Tribal for Standard. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you haven't already, take a minute and click that subscribe button. It's a great way to support the channel for free, and you'll find the next video in the playlist right here.